And we are just in the middle of the morning of this second day of the first International Forum of Digital Taxation and Electronic Invoice, a very successful forum, and the Tax Administration Agency is honored and proud for this collaboration with Mexipac in this brave initiative that this association has via Javier Vega, with his leadership throughout the whole process of electronic invoicing. And from this panel, I want to thank all Mexipac's associates for their collaboration with us. And part of this is the subject of this panel, which is success cases on international companies in the use of electronic invoices. Joining me, Alejandro Montalvo from Costa Rica, Francisco Macias, a very good friend at the Tax Administration Agency, and Vinicius Pimentel on his third panel in this forum. And we are so fortunate to have his collaboration, support, and understanding as Alejandro as well. I thank you for this last-minute integration and your collaboration that we always acknowledge, and thank you for it. This panel, success cases, from the perspective of the Tax Administration Agency, collaboration is important with the private sector, with companies. The existence of authorized suppliers is a pivot for this collaboration in order to have a closer collaboration. Alejandro, I would like if you could tell us about the economic benefits that you think from the perspective of the private initiative from companies, which are the economic benefits this has represented for Costa Rican companies and Central American companies as well, because I imagine that you as GC1 representative are in touch with your colleagues from Central American countries. Which are the benefits you see with the implementation of these electronic invoices, particularly considering that today in Costa Rica, electronic invoices are not mandatory, but the trend goes in that direction. So how do you see these benefits in the economy, and how do you foresee that in the short term the possibility is that electronic invoices will be mandatory in Costa Rica? Well, thank you. Since I have been introduced, I only say that I come from Costa Rica, that before the World Cup was a place and now it's just a better-known country. I don't know if by luck, by virtue, or by some reason out of this world, we did pretty good in the World Cup and people are more familiar with our country now. I would also like our country to be known by the electronic invoice, obviously. And the truth is that Costa Rica is a sui generis country. People and governments have important features, and so far we hope that in this new administration a co-participation and open collaboration will be accepted, because it is difficult to approach government entities to talk straightforward with honesty. It's difficult. It actually has been. And on my personal perspective and as member of the directive of GC1 and as a promoter of electronic invoices, we have continued our advocacy for this process because we believe that benefits will be mutual. Electronic invoices benefits will not only be governmental, but also will be for the private sector. And I believe this is one of our main mistakes because we have focused this as a tool for government control, for tax control for governments. So with time, companies that right now are approximately 1,000 companies in Costa Rica, we are issuing a very low number of invoices. I don't want to say the exact number because we will be in a disadvantage versus other countries. So these companies are beginning to taste the benefits, and I believe we should disseminate this to other taxpayers. And it certainly is that the economy is latent. You can feel it. I was telling someone that I have been using in my company electronic invoices from 3-4 years ago. We issue 350 invoices, and my customers, I tell them, let's make a test and bring me the invoices of a certain municipality where we provide services. And in a single click, my assistant brings me these municipality invoices from the past 12 months. Previous to the implementation of this assistant will tell me it will take me up to a week to gather 1 year's invoices. So this is a non-return process, and this project, answering your next questions, this is a project that must be promoted from the private and governmental sector. We cannot expect either two. I believe it is like a table. It has some legs where needs to be strong, and no leg can be longer or shorter than the others. And it is just an element because it needs to be complemented with other added values. So we are not losing hope. We are waiting for a presidential and ministerial decisions, and we continue our advocacy, as I said, and we hope that this will have the mandatory character. Thank you, Alejandro. You mentioned something important and transcendental for us, and I think for all the forum. And I will ask a question addressed to you three, but I hope Vinicius will be the first one to answer because he comes from the government, because you mentioned the word control. So from the perspective of control, electronic invoicing provides the authority with greater control over the taxpayer, increases tax collection, and we have the possibility of having more accurate, assertive, and fast audits, and with results that can be established in a very short time. Now, considering control, the increase in tax collection, how, in the perspective of the government, with this incentive, how do you invite the private sector to join the project of electronic invoices? Well, thank you again for your invitation. I hope I am not boring the audience with my comments. Well, first, since we have taken this experience to Ecuador and Paraguay along with SIAD, we always mention this, Guillermo. The experience of implementing the system of electronic invoices in a country depends on a series of factors. But one factor that drives particularly the success of this implementation is close collaboration with good companies, because good companies want formality of the market. They want to meet their obligations, but they suffer the unloyal concurrence of informal companies, or those formal companies, in spite of being formal, many of their operations lie in informality. So, to your question, how to attract companies for electronic invoices? Well, when you start a project, like is the case in Costa Rica, a good start is to find large international companies because they have the experience of electronic invoices in other countries, so they will aid you in a pilot project. So, first, tax administration, both, and companies will understand what electronic invoicing is about. So, from this experience forward, the local market of information technology will train in such a way that there will be IT solutions native of that country, of local companies that know how business operate, that they are ready to provide technical assistance of these systems. But this intelligence, this knowledge doesn't fall from the sky because you need an environment of companies and government already working together. There will be a standards stability, and this will be the foundation of the IT environment that may invite more companies to this electronic invoicing. So the question, how can you attract companies to the system? Well, first, a pilot project. Always you invite them to join, or you open this up so companies will volunteer to be part of this pilot project. Because a pilot project, everyone wants it to be successful. And you have partners, you have friends. So you reach to a stable standard, you can expand the system, and resistances, the concerns, because if you're going to have more control, because an increase in tax collection is not because you use electronic invoices, but because the electronic invoices brings in formality, and with formality your tax collection increases. It is not the invoices, it is the formality that increases the tax collection. I don't know if I answer your question. Perfect, great. And from that perspective of collaboration models with the large companies that somehow are like a pivot, so that supplying companies will join the electronic invoice, Paco, I would like you as an advisor of these large companies that have promoted the use of electronic invoices in Mexico, but at the same time, as a public accountant, active in this guild and in the College of Accountants, how do you achieve the convergence of large companies and suppliers, and you as an accountant, how do you convey this good experience towards companies that necessarily need to be joined? They see this as a need to be met in order to sell to these large companies, but they have to be convinced that this is not only to be able to sell, but also as a consequence, this provides savings and more facilities in the control of companies. How, as an accountant, can you convey this to companies surrounding the environment of large companies? Thank you, Memo. Yeah, you're very kind for inviting me to be part of this first forum, the Tax Administration Agency and a Mexipac. Thank you, and try to collaborate with this panel, where I believe that the important and relevant thing that you mentioned is the captive taxpayer. Entrepreneurs per se want to have control of the administration of their companies. If they have the control, and if it is an administration that it's being applied, to share it with the tax administration agency is no problem. The other way, because they know they are meeting their obligations, they are up to date in their obligation, and this brings a fiscal ease of mind. And there is something relevant, which is resistance to change. The printed invoice that lasted 500 years, proof of a commercial transaction that has had many modifications in these 500 years. It was signed with blood, then with the tax ID, several features, and these all represented control on this printed invoice. Resistance to change from companies. One large company of 38,000 employees mentioned that part of the tax from some employees was to write and fill the invoice. And since this electronic invoice becomes mandatory, so they noticed that the half hour it took to employees to fill out invoices, it represented more than 1,500 employments. These people were not laid off, but they were given the opportunity to add different tasks, more productive tasks. So at first, this invoice, AMESE, which was the Association of Electronic Commerce, made a study and decided that the printed invoice had a cost of 120 pesos and the electronic invoice in Mexico cost less than 1 peso. So this is an important saving. So if some company didn't want to join in this, what's the fair in this saving? So companies already had their books electronically. They have their customers control invoices, income collection, but not in a standard acceptable procedure. AMESE has, how was it called, AIDA, and now the tax administration agency didn't use that proceeding, but created the one that ends today with attachment 20 that meets with more requirements for the standardization and the feasibility of electronic invoices. So a formal and in compliance taxpayer that knows that there are proceedings like the addenda where you are going to use your invoice within a process from the purchase order to the collection process of a specific invoice, the production and sales process. This represents more control, more efficient control, and reducing the accidents that paper had, savings in transportations and in guarding activities, courier services, any mistake within the received goods against the invoice. And all of these examples are good for entrepreneurs, and to share these with the tax administration agency, it is good as well because they want to make evident that they are meeting their obligations. So the problem is informal economies, and as it was mentioned yesterday, to make mandatory the electronic invoice for any deduction, for any income, you must have proof of an electronic invoice. So you gradually become a recipient and issuer of an electronic invoice, of a fiscal receipt, and this will bring the informal economy into the formal economy step by step. This is the idea, And I believe this is a great challenge for the year 2014, where these regulations will be applicable and most of the formal and in compliance entrepreneurs will not have any concern to be in compliance with the requirements from the authorities to the tax administration agency. Thank you, Paco. This is important, and you mention it in your book, and we have mentioned it here sometimes. The good relationship that must exist between the authorities and the taxpayer, and that is also being determined in the possibility of electronic invoices. Now, taking as an example the beginning that Costa Rica is having right now, Alejandro, I would like if you could share how right now we're in Costa Rica. It is not mandatory, but according to our discussions, the new Costa Rican administration is promoting this policy of electronic invoices in a more aggressive and decided way. So how, from the private sector perspective, this convergence between authorities and taxpayers, how will the Costa Rican government, from your perspective, is promoting this? So this will polarize to more companies, and in the short term, you will have success cases that certainly you will be discussing and sharing in the second forum. Well, the change of administration in Costa Rica took place very few months ago. This has been a transcendental change, and people decided it was a strong decision. The people's mandate was a winner. The people wanted a change, and the new administration took office. And also, this policy of electronic invoice with a clarity that seems will take us for a good way. And making an analysis and using the word Vinicius used, the environment that we are immersed in, where the taxpayers, the customers, the end user that finally is another taxpayer, because the fiscal administration, private companies that promote the use of technology, that we are specializing in electronic invoices, collection administration, all of these elements of the environment. Well, I think that the government should try to consolidate, direct, and promote this process and the inclusion of electronic invoices more than which one will be first, if the large taxpayers of the small taxpayers, if independent professionals, or who should be first. I say this is also part of the life of an environment, because the government should be a ruling entity and not by itself in a strong and collaborative way with other companies, because as companies we have interests, like is the case of GC1, which I am a member of the board. We are willing and we are trying to team with these associations and with our associates, which are the entrepreneurs, trying to make electronic invoice in the term of 1 year when the second forum will be held. Perhaps I will narrate a different story. We will have more experience. I will have a more convincing case. So, because we are never tired. We never get tired of finding new adaptations and how an invoice should be implemented. Thank you, Alejandro. Well, I think these success cases are important, happy ending stories where we share, because certainly large companies have helped us. We have been able to push those others around them in their environment, as Vinicius explained. But certainly there are some resistance cases where paradigms are not broken so fast. There are some example, like in the case of Mexico, because we stated a term for electronic invoices in its mandatory feature, and as the due date came closer, guilds of accountants, lawyers, companies, chambers to request an extension of these terms because they asked for help because they felt their systems didn't have the capacity for it. This is one of the challenges we had in Mexico. So, Vinicius, which are the challenges Brazil faced in their complex fiscal structure, and how have you overcome them? Well, the main challenges are not particular of Brazil or from a tax system that is complex. I don't think there isn't any complex fiscal administration. In fact, I believe the Polytechnic School of Milan produced the results of our research of the adoption of electronic invoices in different countries of the world, the European Union, and countries from OCD. So, which were the experiences, the common experiences of these countries? Well, in none of them there was this sense of compulsiveness. And in no place of the world we could see more than 20% of adoption of electronic invoices when you let it at the free will of the taxpayers. And then it comes the question, which are the challenges? If this is so good for companies, why don't they all have electronic invoices? And we saw two reasons that lead companies to continue to have printed invoices. The first one is that to meet with a fiscal obligation is something that is not in the system of companies, and it is a responsibility and an obligation. And the information for invoicing for fiscal systems comes from the same resource, but it is not the same information for the accounting systems. And with this, we have mistakes, problems, because it costs more for companies to develop a single module to have electronic invoices, because the solution to communicate with their customers and suppliers electronically is already there. To issue an invoice represents an extra cost that adds nothing to the business, because they think they don't need this to improve their commercial relationships, because fiscal systems, information in many companies, certainly this is not a case for all, but in many companies this represents a cost, and if this will add nothing to the business, they don't see a reason why to do so. This is part of the problem. Another part, and this is more present not in developed countries, but rather in developing countries, lies in control. Because the market in the countries, as less developed the country is, more informal the market is. If voluntarily they will issue electronic invoices, they might opt, but they feel that they are left out from the informal market, because if they think that if they become formal, they will lose market share. So I believe these are one of the challenges of the administration in the implementation of electronic invoices systems. And the challenge is how to dress it so they will be attractive for companies and they can adopt these systems. Okay, how to make it attractive, Paco, and as an advisor, how would you help these companies to see this system as attractive in spite of the incentives they it has, but the companies are not willing to do so? So as an advisor, how do you convince to overcome this challenge in large companies, but particularly in small and medium companies, particularly small companies, because earlier we listened to the example from Maximo Frias that has been a great lesson and learned, a gratifying lesson, because to us, like a tax administration agency, they tell us, how would you like someone from the high hills of Chiapas will issue an electronic invoice? And because of these examples, many times large companies or medium-sized companies want to extract themselves from the possibility to implement new technologies in their processes. So how, from the advisory perspective of companies, how do you convince these to the use of new technologies that will yield success cases in the same companies? I think we can start from the statement that the electronic invoices do not add an added value to the company. The first incursions in electronic invoices, the fiscal specialist decided that no fiscal savings was achieved. The systems specialist agreed that no added value was included because the books were already there. And the financial specialist that could determine the savings couldn't take them because they rely on fiscal compliance and in the way the books were taken in the systems. So I think that success the development of this invoice has had in Mexico is because the joint participation between the tax administration agency and the sectors that are developing invoices in this period that lasted more than 10 years. First, it was not mandatory, then for some, and now for all. This way to begin, like in Walmart of Mexico, where there was a straightforward communication to see which were advantages and disadvantages, how to make a proper flow of information in order to have fiscal information, is what is the result of developing best practices. So I am convinced that as long as it wasn't mandatory, as you said, 20%, some countries are just initiating and they are somehow fearful. So when this becomes mandatory and you must comply with it, Mexico was a spear of the arrow, and I believe Mexico is leader now, and I'm sure Mexico's models will be copied by many countries and many administrations because they will produce best practices in this matter. So how do these large companies permeate to small and medium-sized companies? Well, because of the benefits, bounties that the administration may have before the result of control and administration. So if this benefit is produced, if the authority gives you the facility to have an invoice in your phone, this provides you with access to Invoice in the transportation lot in remote locations where no one ever thought the authority would be present in those places, municipalities. The communication through electronic means provides you with this wireless access where now you can have a true and timely information that will give you the administrative control resulting in information to comply with the fiscal obligation. If this is the way things are to be, this is how companies are stimulated to be part of this. There should be an important pressure to convince them, and I am certain that the way to do this, to take agreements and covenants with different sectors of the economy, with different sectors of professionals, of companies, entrepreneurials, boards of administration. This makes the authority to see the needs and under the principle of not changing the operation but do comply with the fiscal obligation is yielding good results. And I think that this will generate best practices and will be an element that I'm certain will be copied by other countries. If not copy, at least will inspire other countries. In this effort taken by Mexico, and this is one of the objectives, to convey from the private sector, a Mexipac, and from the public sector, the tax administration agency, to convey this joint effort from the past few years since the seed of this project, a little more than 10 years ago. And with this perspective, Alejandro, the use of new technologies to break paradigms, to be able to be a success case in the next forum, how do the private sector, Costa Rican entrepreneurs, how have they embraced this possibility to be part of electronic invoicing if the electronic invoice system, as Vinicius and Paco says, per se will not bring fiscal benefits or savings at first sight? So how, from your perspective of Costa Rican private sector, how do you think companies will see this in this period where the electronic invoice is beginning? How will they break these paradigms and how they will be part of new models, new technologies, and best practices? Well, the electronic invoice is no man's territory for most of the entrepreneurials, and that is our starting point. And because if we know that to be fit and to exercise every morning is good, why don't we all exercise, right? So why don't we? Because we know if I ask anyone, anyone will tell us, yes, I know it's good to exercise, but who exercises? I don't. I don't. I will not raise my hand, but at the end of the day, why don't we all exercise? If we know that the electronic invoice brings benefits, they are convincing regarding cost. I do not agree that it doesn't improve the company's status. This is just something that entrepreneurs do not know. I have a project in a state university, in a project of entrepreneurship. We have noticed that we have launched to the national and international markets very good veterinarians, physicians, attorneys, educators, engineers, but as professionals, not as entrepreneurs, with a very neat, tight thinking pattern. If I go to any physician, any OB specialist in this year, how many times have you performed a specific procedure? They don't know this business intelligence that we could convert in an accounting information that people think that their taxes will be controlled, to transform it into a business intelligence to promote like a GI specialist. If a GI specialist will perform a study, an endoscopy. Perhaps they will perform on Tuesday because on Tuesday most people go to their office. But this is technology, this is accounting information, and we can transform it into a business intelligence. So, what has happened? In this side of the world, we have launched to the world professionals that do not have a company because they don't have this entrepreneurial spirit. They lack this education, so companies or professionals become no formal professionals, no formal companies, and they see the tax administration agencies of every country, they see this like a control means to see how they take money from us to fund the government, that the government never has good projects or doesn't spend good in a good way our money. So at the end of the time, we must break the cycle. This is what we should do. This is the message. We should break this cycle. We should turn back into our education, go at schools, colleges, universities, create more serious entrepreneurs, but not only from the perspective of creating a company, to create a responsible entrepreneur with corporate responsibility. And they will see the benefits of electronic invoices also as to have a clean and transparent organization. Certainly, I am convinced that at the end, the electronic invoice will attract benefits to our countries, but we should really take a few steps back. I cannot explain why 20% of companies use electronic invoices because, as I said, this is no man's land, and we should show proof, go to the foundation, so new entrepreneurs will bring in them this advantage, this initiative, so they will use this electronic invoice information as business intelligence. Okay, you mentioned business intelligence, entrepreneurship, best practices, which are concepts that need to be permeated amongst taxpayers from the authority environment, but certainly from the private environment as GC1 representatives of the College of Accountants, and so on. But Vinicius, I would like if you could share, just to close this panel because time is on top of us, talking about business intelligence, entrepreneurship, best practices, how Brazil, using these concepts, has promoted the electronic invoice, and how, from the perspective of the Brazilian authority, can you recommend the use of electronic invoice, how to disseminate the use of electronic invoice as a better use of business intelligence, as a best practice, and as the development of entrepreneurship in our countries? Well, it will not take me more than 45 minutes to answer you this. Well, it's just that to talk about the possibilities of business intelligence from the information of an electronic invoice system, at least 3, 4, 5 different currents to highlight in the fiscal administration for the calculation of fiscal incentives, for intensive and extensive control, for the study of fiscal changes impact, if they are going to low or rise the rate of 0.5%, all of this in terms of business intelligence. Well, from the perspective of companies, I think that there aren't many advantages to use the electronic invoice in this sense, because finally the information is already in their financial system. For the case of what has been discussed throughout this panel on how to promote the application or the adoption of electronic invoices, then we must think, how are we going to face the problems that I mentioned earlier? The two main problems which are obstacles for this adoption. First, informality, and second, that companies' systems do not need of this fiscal information to work. And the first thing is something obvious, because we know that in Brazil in 2003, electronic invoices were mandatory for power generation, communications, and telecommunications. From 2008 to 2010 for the industrial sector, distribution, and trade in bulk, and then for retailers. And with these, we reduce the possibility for a formal operation without electronic invoice. We stop the argument that a concurrent may hide the business, because we are all in the electronic system, and it only leaves out informality. And to fight informality, then we have the tools that we took in the first forum, how to bring people from informality to formality. So these are the two paths that are possible. As for the expansion of electronic invoices, and once it is mandatory, companies' systems will be developed by, and I'm sure here we have suppliers of technical assistance, because information systems will be developed with this in mind. And in order to be efficient, from the tax administration agencies, we have a huge responsibility, which is stability of standards. Because I don't know in your countries, but we don't know how to be stable. We must learn how to be stable. And this is against us. If we are stable in the standards, then systems are to be stable and will be developed to address the necessary information to the business administrator that puts in the capital and wants a profit capital, and also that this information will reach the fiscal administration. If this information is in the same source and leaves the source at the same time, so today's mistakes in the invoicing systems, and those of you that already have electronic invoices in your countries know that the quality of information takes its time to be useful in all of these advantages that have been mentioned since yesterday and today. The use of this information is what makes an information good. When information is not used, then it is not known, and there's nothing to do about it. So to finish and to answer the title of this panel, which is Success Cases of International Companies in the Electronic Invoices Use, and which is the model that we have on Brazil. Well, as I said, an electronic invoice, it's a general with many species. In Brazil, we have committees where companies and the fiscal administration participate, and they discuss with us regarding what is good, what needs to change, and what is necessary to innovate in the electronic invoice system. Because some people think and say, no, the electronic invoice system was created in 2006. It became mandatory in 2008, and from 2010, there are no more possibilities to operate outside the formality. So the system is ready. Well, no. Now that we have a critical mass of companies, critical mass of information, then we should make this model good for us. And the way to do so is forming committees. So we have a committee of companies from the industrial sector, distribution sector, bulk sector, and a representative of these companies is a representative of an international company. In Mexico, we have one, Gerdau. Another committee is from retail companies. A representative of this committee is one of a friend of ours from Walmart. And the sector of transportation, the representative is from an airline company. So international companies are the ones that are more interested first that the system exists, that the system works, and more importantly, yesterday that the head of a tax administration agency, they want to walk in a path that a type of standardization might be possible. I feel that to think that there will be an international pattern of electronic invoices to be adopted by all, it's an utopia. It would be great, but still it's an utopia. What has been working in SEAT from 2010 is to have an international electronic invoice, because this is not the same, because all of us have different invoices depending on our countries or in certain economic blocks, like in Mercosur, European Union, Free Trade Alignment of North America. But when the globalized trade, and this is what I think, I am not talking representing Brazil, this is my personal opinion, when we have the need of an international invoice that will allow the sharing of information of tax administration agencies, like some transference cost, and most importantly, that companies will share information globalized and standardized regardless of the fiscal regulation of this country origin of the goods and regardless of the tax administration of the country of destination for these goods, because it is possible that the same invoice will have the standards for all the countries of the world. And perhaps if we ever have this international invoice, perhaps my grandchildren will see it. Yes, certainly we will be able to see it. And when these Incoterms were created that standardize the terms of international trade, this is the way they thought about it. And why wouldn't we think about adding a fiscal Incoterm that could be electronic invoice or a bill of lading? It could be something that could be extracted from this. But this is subject for another panel, and I believe that the next panel that will talk about the experience from representatives of international companies, I'm sure this will be successful experiences that will enrich us as well. So in this sense, Paco, as Mexican international companies representatives, could you convey in this very short time a success case, so we can give the floor to Alejandro and then close the panel. Yes, thank you so much. Yesterday and today we have been discussing electronic invoice, but not in the Code of Commerce or in the fiscal code do we have the concept of an electronic invoice. This is the CFDI, the electronic fiscal receipt. And where does the word stamped comes? It is when you had an invoice and you stamped this, and this stamp was male and female, where you cut the stamp and had the year and the numeration, and when the authority wanted to review, they were matching if this stamp was female and male to see if true it corresponded to the original. That's why we have stamped, so to see that if it actually corresponds to the original document. I believe we should permeate the concept of invoice in all the environment. The culture to be a taxpayer is essential, not only in accounting firms or in administration firms, but in all, because taxpayers are everyone. Everyone should know what's an invoice, what's electronic, why they should meet their obligations, and so on. So to permeate this to universities, to education is fundamental. The concept of contributive culture or fiscal civism, it's important, so then we will harvest good results for those that meet the requirements and for the authority that will verify this compliance. In the environment of companies, I believe we always have the willingness to comply when it is a captive taxpayer and the entrepreneurs want to comply with the law. What we want is to establish a communication as has been lately, and we hope that this will not change. We hope that this will have continuity in time, that will be adapt according to the needs. A few days ago, regarding travel agencies and airline companies, there is a specific way to comply with the requirement to obtain this electronic invoice. This is how the authorities should work with the company's stakeholders to have this facility of compliance without modifying the administrative and operational structure of businesses. Yes, certainly stability will result in certainty, and certainty will result in facility, and this will yield in fiscal compliance. So, Alejandro, as a closing statement, I will thank you for your comments. Well, I want to talk about our obligation, our commitment to work not as a government company or taxpayer, just as an element of this environment, in working in education, in teaching at first why an invoice should be issued, because at the end of the day we learn by example, because everyone enjoys going to these Apple stores. The Apple store, because you go by and the same consultant or advisor or seller that tell you buy this, add memory, is the same one that takes your credit card, invoice, issues you the invoice, asks your email, and you are going to grab a cab, your invoice is already in your mailbox. Everyone enjoys that. This is the first experience that we had, and everyone is left with the mouth wide open. This is what we want. This is an example. And as we move forward, as people realize these people, Mexico's neighbors, we see of this process that started in Mexico, because there are still some people that are not convinced and go to the stores and buy their paper invoices, we will notice and we will need to join this environment, um, change the process in our companies and the relationship with tax agencies through this method of electronic invoice. Thank you all. Thank you, Alejandro, Paco. I don't know how we are on time. Yes, we will have a small session of 3 questions. A Q&A session. Please raise your hand so the floor attendants will bring you the microphone. Good morning. I am Jaime Novelo from the College of Accountants in Cancun, and I must start this question apologizing to the organizers, particularly to the facilitator Guillermo Valls, because this question is not regarding the subject of this panel, but to the previous one. I didn't have the opportunity to ask the question, but if you don't want to answer my question, I will understand. So my question is this. In Mexico, we do have a new legislation, and to the speakers of these panels, I would like to ask them how in their countries have they solved the problem that we have in Mexico that, to my perspective and to the perspective of many colleagues, is not solved yet. And it is not about micro companies. It's about micro companies. The people that have a position in the flea market, people that sell vegetables, people that collect used clothes and they sell these in these flea markets. Because the president, the director of the tax administration agency mentioned, because there are people that do want to be taxpayer and pay their taxes, and many people that don't want to. Have you solved this problem in your countries? And if so, how of this case of mini companies? Because we can call an entrepreneur anyone that has the action of buying and selling. So it is not the subject, but the object. Have you have solved this problem that we have in Mexico? Because we have millions of Mexico that are not even paying 1 peso or 50 or 100 pesos of taxes per month. And are you considering the possibility to demand, which would be a situation that would occur? What would you do with these taxes? Well, that's a very good question. And we must go into another topic, change gears, and refer to the academia. And see, when we relate this to the orthodox fiscal science, there's no answer. So we could rely on non-orthodox fiscal science. And for this, there are some solutions in some places of the world. I can comment what we are starting to do in Brazil. And this is something I discussed earlier, the micro entrepreneur, individual micro entrepreneur. They have a tax ID. For us, it is a CNPJ. So this person must pay an fixed monthly amount, and with this, all the fiscal obligations are met. This is a way to do so. It is not the only way. It works. Well, with this, you can bring people into formality, and you excuse them the issuance of mandatory electronic invoices, the vegetable lady, anything from anyone that sells something in the corner of a street, because these people really do have low incomes and they will never use electronic invoices because they will not leave the beach or the curb or the street to a place where there's a module with a modem to issue their electronic invoice. Simply, this will not happen. So I believe that the road to this is in the non-orthodox fiscalization. And this is not an easy solution to export because it depends on the culture of people, and each country must find its own way to do so. Thank you, Vinicio. As you said, this is a unique situation. There is not one for all recipe. We have multiple realities in the same country. In Mexico, this subject that you mentioned of a fixed amount was current almost 7 or 8 years, which were the extinct Repeco regime, which was the small taxpayers regime, where actually a very few percentage of these payers paid. And now this effort under the mandate of the legislative branch is this. It is an effort that we are working hard in our agency. In the previous panel, Pati Delgado, Maximo, and the specialist that attended today's first panel, they talk about this effort and talk about the commitment that we have had from taxpayers that have committed to this project, as Maximo explained, throughout our country. It certainly is not an easy topic. It is not solved yet. But the transition provided by the law of the income tax, and it's been applied now, but particularly the commitment of taxpayers will result in a possibility of a closer success than that in the extinct and failed Repeco. And we hope that we have answered your question. I believe there were two more questions. Yes, there are two more questions. Anyone cares to ask another question? Well, without further ado, I want to thank Vinicius, Paco, Alejandro, their willingness, their very interesting comments, and their visit in this forum. And so we have a date for the second forum, Alejandro, so you can share your success cases. Yes, I will bring my tennis shoes, so I will join Fernando in his morning exercise.